They fought longer than any other American unit in World War I. They never lost a single trench, never surrendered a post. The Germans gave them a name, Hellfighters. The French awarded them the highest honors they had, and the U.S. Army. The U.S. forgot them, or tried to. There was no marching band waiting. No medals, no pensions. Some of them came home as injured heroes and died as invisible men. This is not just a story about war. It's about what we choose not to remember, because the truth is too heavy to carry. This is the story of the Harlem Hellfighters, and this is the Forgotten File. On a cold October morning in 1917, a line of black men waited in silence at an enlistment office in Harlem. Some were sons of sharecroppers from Georgia. Others were bellboys, musicians, porters, barbers, clerks. They didn't come from wealth or power, but they came dressed in their Sunday coats, boots shined, papers tucked in their hands like it might matter. To them, it did. Because this war, however distant, was a chance at something they'd always been denied. Proof that they were just as American as anyone else, that they deserved to be seen. So they signed up, names on papers, sworn oaths, promises made. And nearly all of them right after were handed shovels instead of rifles. Their job? To dig trenches, unload bodies, build roads in the rain for white battalions to march on. That was the deal black soldiers got from the U.S. Army. But one regiment refused to fade into the background. They were called the 15th New York National Guard, regular black men from Harlem, who believed service required not just labor, but sacrifice. They wanted a frontline post. They wanted to matter. And against every odd, they got it. Of course, the U.S. military still wouldn't let them fight beside white troops, not outwardly. So they passed the 15th to the French, literally gave them away. France accepted them gratefully, gave them blue helmets, French rifles, a position on the front lines of one of the worst sectors on the Western Front. That's where the 15th became the 369th Infantry Regiment, later called the asterisk Harlem Hellfighters. They didn't know yet what was coming. They were ready for it. There was one man among them no one would have noticed at first. Private Henry Johnson. He's just 5'4", worked as a porter for the railroad in Albany. He was the man who loaded heavy luggage, tipped his hat, thanked people who wouldn't speak to him, didn't write speeches or lead marches. He lived quiet, dignified, invisible, but not for long. Johnson shipped out with the 369th in December of 1917. He kept mostly to himself, wrote letters home, smiled once in a while, but deep down, carried something that hadn't been given to him. He carried belief. Belief that America would recognize him as a man for what he was doing. The 369th landed in France. They trained hard, ate what the French gave them, lived in the same soggy trenches as everyone else. When shellfire started, they held. And then, one night, deep in the Argonne forest, the real test came. Johnson was on sentry duty with another soldier, Needham Roberts. In the dark, they heard movement. Needham was hit first, wounded, screaming. Johnson fired until his rifle jammed. Switched to a French bolo knife, then a club, then fists. He fought off over a dozen German soldiers alone. He killed or wounded the entire patrol. He kept Needham alive. When reinforcements found them, Johnson was holding a blood-soaked knife and wouldn't let the medics touch him until they helped his partner. Took 21 wounds that night. 21. Let's mark this moment. No one expected a black private to beat back a team of elite raiders. No one expected that one of the most brutal, fearless single men stands in modern U.S. military history would belong to a man America barely acknowledged. But it happened. Right there in the dark French mud, history was made. And almost immediately, America tried to forget. The French gave Henry Johnson the asterisk Croix de Guerre, their highest military honor. They called him the Black Death. They sang his name. But when Johnson returned home to the U.S., there was no medal, no parade, no handshake. He limped into Harlem with his coat torn and lungs damaged. He tried to get help from the Army. They told him there was no record of him being wounded, that maybe he was lying. See, the War Department didn't want stories like Henry's getting out. Because if the truth came forward, that black soldiers had fought, bled, and saved their comrades under fire, they feared it would stir dangerous ideas. It's ideas that black Americans didn't owe anyone. Ideas that they had already paid the cost of freedom. In the years that followed, Henry Johnson couldn't work because of his injuries. No pension, no compensation. He died 10 years after the war, poor, alone, and buried in a city grave with no headstone. He was 32 years old. And the Hellfighters, most of them didn't fare much better. They stayed on the front line for 191 days, the longest deployment of any American unit in the entire war. They fought in Champaign, Argonne, and Meuse. They endured gas attacks, mud rot, shell shock, cold. Some of them never even got uniforms that fit. And yet, they never surrendered an inch. They never ran. Their record was flawless. But America didn't want a flawless black battalion to be part of the story. So records were redacted, reworded, buried. Commanders who praised them had their accounts edited or removed from print. The term Harlem Hellfighters became a nickname, not an official label, and by the next generation, hardly anyone remembered what they had done. That's where the mystery begins. Because today, when we talk about World War I, we mention trenches. We mention white soldiers with rifles. We rarely mention black heroes holding the line. Why not? Why does Henry Johnson's name appear in French war memorials, but not in our textbooks? Why does his Medal of Honor arrive nearly 100 years too late? What are we really afraid of remembering? This isn't just a story of one man. It's the story of a regiment, of an unanswered promise, of a flag that saw what they did but turned the other way. But the truth never really disappears. Not forever. It just waits. In attics, in letters, in the stories passed down under breath, until someone finally says that matters. We can't forget that. You saw how it began, but we're not done. In the next part, we uncovered just how deep this cover-up went. How the US government suppressed the 369th Service, why powerful names worked to keep their records redacted, and how a grandson refused to let the truth stay buried. He would spend decades fighting so the world could finally know who Henry Johnson truly was and who America chose not to see. This is The Forgotten File. If this story moved you, share it. Speak their names. Be part of their memory. When Henry Johnson got home, nobody met him at the dock. There was no welcome committee. No medal, no telegram from the White House, no promise fulfilled. He walked home with shattered bones and an injured spine, wounds that didn't exist, according to the Army's paperwork. He told newspapers what happened in France. He talked about fighting off a dozen Germans with a knife and bleeding through his socks. The headlines called him America's black hero. But not long after that, the Army shut the story down. They said his reports were unconfirmed, that no records supported his alleged heroism, that maybe he exaggerated. They hinted he was making it up. The newspapers moved on, and Henry stopped talking. Back in Harlem, he couldn't work, could barely walk. He applied for disability payments. The government turned him down. He applied again, denied. Again, denied. They said he was never officially wounded in combat. Even though his body told the story every day he tried to get out of bed, his medals went missing, his name faded, and the man who once held back a German ambush with a bolo knife died alone, unknown, and broke in a cheap apartment. He was 32 years old, buried in a grave with no name. Still no one talked about it. Not Henry, not the Army, not the country that owed him everything, because this wasn't just about him. This was about all of them. The entire 369th Infantry, the Harlem Hellfighters, who came home to find their country pretending they didn't exist. No honors, no banners. Their commanders had written glowing reports about them after the war, said they were the finest regiment under fire, said they were brothers on the battlefield. But by the time those reports reached Washington, most were missing pages, removed, rewritten, buried in filing cabinets marked Foreign Command. Some senior officers even lobbied to have records of the Hellfighters sealed, redacted, or dismissed for classified inconsistencies. In plain English, they were hiding the truth. The US was preparing for life after World War I, and there were voices in Congress, powerful voices, who feared that if black soldiers came home as war heroes, they'd start asking for things at home. Fair housing, equal pay, voting rights, respect. And so, the Harlem Hellfighters were buried. Early and deliberately, beneath whitewashed history and bureaucratic indifference, the military made sure no one ever compiled their full record. No full unit commendations, no monument, no annual remembrance, just silence. Meanwhile, men who had served alongside them vanished into poverty. Elijah Brooks, a hellfighter from Detroit who helped evacuate a French hospital during a chemical attack, died selling newspapers. Jasper Hunter, wounded during a shell blast in Meuse, died without a death certificate. His body was claimed by his nephew decades later. Whole families filed claims, all denied. Because the records didn't exist anymore. Because the country they served decided, quietly, they weren't part of the story. Years later, in the 1940s, when World War II began, someone in the Pentagon actually suggested using the Harlem Hellfighters as an example, a way to encourage black enlistment again. But the pushback was instant. No need to create dangerous narratives, one memo said. They served under French command, and results were not comparable. Let's call that what it was, a lie. The 369th outperformed expectations. They were the only American unit to never lose an inch of ground. But accepting that meant rewriting who gets to be a hero. And for those in power, that was easier to ignore than to admit. It wasn't until decades later that someone started asking questions again. It wasn't a general. It wasn't a senator. It was a grandson. His name was Isaac Johnson. He grew up hearing rumors about Henry, not from army records, but from barbershop talk and old church ladies who'd known him. Isaac never knew much. But one day, digging through old boxes in the back of his father's closet, he found it, a tattered envelope. Inside were old French papers sealed with wax, decaying photograph of a man in uniform with clear, serious eyes, the French medal, Croix de Guerre still polished, a note his father had written, barely legible. They never gave him one here. Keep this. That was the moment Isaac realized this wasn't just family history. It was American history, hidden, missing, stolen. He began writing letters to the Army, to the VA, to city officials, then Washington. All came back the same. We regret there is no record of Henry Johnson's injuries or citation. Perhaps the French decorated him in error. But Isaac didn't stop. He searched deeper. Newspapers from 1918, French military archives. Survivors' letters from other soldiers in the Hellfighters. A map. A trench coat identifier. A battlefield diary from Johnson's squadmate. In the margins, the words, "HJ saved me." Still hard to sleep. Proof kept piling up. He knocked on every door. He went to every civic meeting. Showed up to every memorial ceremony with Henry's photo in his hand. Still no action. Till 2002, when a New York senator read Isaac's letter and couldn't believe what he saw. That senator was Chuck Schumer. Schumer filed a formal request for a Medal of Honor review. The Department of Defense stalled for years, but the pressure grew. Journalists started whispering. Black veterans organizations began backing Isaac. Activists protested. Even school teachers joined in, teaching the story no textbook would publish. And finally, in 2015, almost a full century after, Henry Johnson killed half a German raiding party alone in the woods. The White House called. President Barack Obama stood at a podium in front of a packed crowd at the White House. He held up a framed medal. He said Henry Johnson should have received this a long time ago. But we are a nation that honors the truth. Isaac was in the front row, holding back tears. And behind him, pictures of the 369th Infantry finally projected on screen. These were the men who were supposed to be forgotten. Now the silence was broken. But it wasn't just about one medal. This was more than finally honoring Henry Johnson. This was about every soldier like him, still waiting, still unrecognized, still buried under falsehoods, still missing, not because they got lost, but because someone didn't want them to be found. Isaac was given an apology, but he didn't want one. What he wanted was his grandfather's full record restored. A pension paid retroactively, not to him, but to the legacy taken from black veterans for so many years. He wanted justice, not written in speeches, but in source documents. Names, dates, Benefits delivered, monuments built. Because he knew the truth, they didn't win the war for themselves. They won it for a country that didn't see them. We can't let it happen again. Still, many families of Hellfighters are waiting. The Army has yet to create a permanent exhibit honoring them. The 369th Infantry Regiment is barely mentioned in most major WWI documentaries. Henry Johnson wasn't added to school history curriculums across the U.S. Despite his Medal of Honor, the silence still lingers, but history doesn't disappear on its own. Someone has to go digging through it, someone like Isaac, someone like you. In the next chapter, we'll return to Harlem, to the music, the marches, and the memorials that kept these names alive when official records failed too. We'll meet the voices who refuse to go silent, the families who still carry regimental flags in church parades, and the jazz bands who gave rhythm to resistance, keeping the heart of the Hellfighters pounding beyond the grave. Because this story isn't over. Not until we speak every name the world tried to forget. You're watching The Forgotten File. Stay with us. Leave Hellfighter in the comments if you're still with us. Share this video. Keep their stories alive. Some stories don't disappear. They get silenced. Not with fire, not with force, but with time. Paperwork that quietly vanishes. Its names misspelled on purpose. Questions that get answered with a shrug. That was the story of the Harlem Hellfighters for nearly a century. But even silence eventually breaks. When the records failed them, music remembered. When their medals were lost, family remembered. And when textbooks ignored them, communities whispered the truth loud enough to wake the dead. This is what happened after the battlefield. This is what erasure looked like, and how legacy came back to life. In the years after the war, the government barely paid attention to black veterans. They were often excluded from benefits granted to white soldiers. They were denied homes, land grants, educational access. And for the Hellfighters, they weren't even given identity as a unit. The 93rd Division, the parent unit that included the Hellfighters, was largely absent from U.S. war memorials. And yet thousands of children in Harlem grew up hearing names like Sergeant Adams or Private Gideon whispered with respect at dinner tables. No army cared, but the families did. They kept old pictures under floorboards, medals in cigar boxes, letters pressed into Bibles. Because if they didn't hold the memory, it would disappear for good. One of those threads was James Reese Europe, classically trained conductor and veteran. Europe had served as the band leader for the 369th Infantry during the war. His band played on the docks as the regiment boarded for France, then played for hospitals, towns, and commanders along the front lines between battles. Even under threat of literal bombs. He wasn't just a musician. He was a builder of spirit, identity, and pride in a regiment that the world saw as expendable. When the Hellfighters marched through France, children waved not because they were curious about Americans, but because Europe's marching band brought jazz overseas. He changed the sound of a generation. And when he came home, he was murdered by a bandmate after a personal argument. No monument. No celebrity funeral. It's just another black man mourned briefly, then forgotten. But his music, that sound, stayed. And it would be the key in keeping the Hellfighters alive. Decades later, in the jazz clubs of Harlem, small groups started naming themselves after the famous regiment. The Hellfighter Band, 369 Stompers. They wore French pins, sang songs in the style of James Reese's Europe. For them, it wasn't history. It was family. It was identity in a city that still didn't want to hand them ownership of victory. They marched every Veterans Day with no official float, played for free at war memorials where their fathers' names were left off plaques, told their kids that if schools didn't teach them, they'd better learn it at home. And in one Harlem church, around the year 1999, a boy named Elijah Green asked his grandmother why everyone stood when they sang over there. She said, "Because our boys bled to that tune." But only a few got names. That boy, now a city council member, would go on to lead efforts to build a community memorial for the 369th Regiment in New York. It's still in progress today, from donations, because the government might award medals, but it's the people who build monuments. In 2003, a small Brooklyn museum curated a temporary exhibit called The Forgotten Battalion. 20 black and white photos, 2 authentic uniforms, a trumpet from 1918, and one worn patch that simply read, 369, no sponsors. No press, but it sold out every single weekend. Grandfathers came. Young kids came with notebooks. Veterans came and sat in silence in front of the photo of Henry Johnson. A few wept. One woman said, "I never knew why my father never talked after the war. Now I do." And then came 2015. Henry Johnson's name had been restored. His Medal of Honor was finally awarded. President Obama delivered the speech personally. And Isaac Johnson, standing just feet from the podium, held the same medal that lived tucked away in a manila envelope for most of his life. He looked at the cameras. My grandfather never asked for this. What he didn't know was that a small town in France had already built a memorial for Henry years earlier. Near the place where he held the line alone in 1918, villagers planted trees around the site. They told their children, a black American defended them where others failed. They etched his name on a stone. So even before his own country acknowledged him, a continent away, strangers honored a man America had buried in silence. Today, the 369th is slowly entering American consciousness, piece by piece. They've been featured in comics, jazz tributes, children's books, and short documentaries. Public schools in New York have begun teaching their contributions, some even visiting French cemeteries as part of class trips. But most of America still doesn't know, still sees WWI as black and white trench films and dusty generals. Not as the war where poor black boys from Harlem wore French helmets and took bullets for a flag that remained pointed at them, even after peace. And that's why we tell the story. Because to forget them is to lose something essential about this country's truth. Not just about war, but about dignity, resistance, and the price of being a hero while black. Because they weren't written into the script. Because the story of America winning a war with the help of an all-black regiment didn't fit the theater of segregation. Because truth sometimes is treated like it's dangerous. It's just a pride. But that danger, that's where the forgotten file begins. We go into the dark corners. We shine the lights. We open the boxes marked, "Do not research." We say them, again and again, until they echo. Henry Johnson, James Reese Europe, Needham Roberts, Clarence Langston, Sergeant Eugene Bullard, Jasper Hunter, Elijah Brooks. Say them like they mattered because they did. Say them like they weren't ghosts because they weren't. Musicians, this is a beginning. The moment you become the voice that carries the truth forward. Because history belongs to those who remember intentionally, not just what happened, but what was meant to be erased. And the Hellfighters. They'll only stay forgotten if we let them. You've been watching The Forgotten File? If you're here at the end, drop a Hellfighter in the comments so we know you stand with them. Subscribe for more erased stories we're bringing back. Share this episode. If one person hears it, history grows stronger. Because when memory is fierce, no legacy dies quietly.